Hello friends, and welcome back to the channel where biblical backgrounds matter. We're finishing up our historical overview of the Old Testament. The Neo-Babylonian Empire, 600 to 550 BC. When the Babylonians declared independence from the Assyrians in 626 BC, it was the Chaldean Nabo-Polassar who claimed the throne. For the next decade, he successfully maintained control of Babylon, but was unable to extend his rule any further into Assyrian territory. It was clear that Assyria was losing its grasp on the empire. However, Nabo-Polassar was not the only one scrambling to take over Assyrian interests. To the east, Cyaxares, the Mede, was also moving against major interest, or major Assyrian strongholds. In 614 BC, one of those, the city of Ashur, fell to the Medes, and outside the ruins of the city, the late arriving Nabo-Polassar and the victorious Cyaxares made a pact to join their forces against the floundering Assyrians. Their joint armies were able to bring down the mighty capital of Nineveh just 2 years later, in 612 BC. The Assyrian government retreated west and regrouped with its headquarters in Haran. Sin-Sharishkan had died in the fall of Nineveh, so Ashurbanipal assumed the throne, destined to become Assyria's last king. In 610, Haran capitulated, and the Assyrians were forced to retreat another 50 miles west to Carchemish, on the west bank of the upper reaches of the Euphrates, just inside modern-day Turkey. Here, though reinforced by the Egyptians under Pharaoh Necho, the Assyrian Empire ended when Nebuchadnezzar, crown prince of Babylon and commander-in-chief of the armies, stormed Carchemish and scattered what was left of the Assyrians, pursuing them as far as south as Hamath and claiming Syria for the Babylonian realm. That very year, Nabo-Polassar died, and Syria for the Babylonian realm. And Nebuchadnezzar rushed back to Babylon, where he assumed the throne of what had now become the Neo-Babylonian Empire. Nebuchadnezzar was one of the most successful kings known to history. He ruled from 605 to 562 BC and distinguished himself in both military matters and domestic undertakings, foremost of which was the beautification of the city of Babylon. The Assyrian Empire had been divided between the Babylonians and their allies, the Medes. The Babylonians received the Tigris and Euphrates basins from a line just east of the Tigris, approximating the boundaries between modern states of Iraq and Iran, and all of the western states extending as far north as the southeast section of Asia Minor. The Medes ruled the eastern regions, modern-day Iran, Urartu between the Black and Caspian Seas, and the eastern section of Asia Minor. Eventually, Nebuchadnezzar was able to extend his domain to include Egypt in 586 BC. The establishment of the Neo-Babylonian Empire had far-reached effects on Judah. Apparently hoping to contribute to the downfall of Assyria, Josiah attempted to stop the advance of the Egyptian armies, hurrying to provide assistance to Ashurbanipal in Carchemish. This proved to be a fatal decision because Josiah, who had accomplished more reform than any of his Davidic predecessors, was killed in the losing efforts. He was succeeded to the throne in turn by 3 sons and a grandson. Jehoahaz, the first son, was taken into exile in Egypt. After serving only 3 months, this occurred upon Necho's return from Syria in 609 BC. Jehoiakim, a second son, was placed on the throne instead once Nebuchadnezzar had defeated the Assyrian-Egyptian coalition and claimed control of Syro-Palestine. Jehoiakim became a Babylonian vassal. This lasted until he rebelled in 598 BC. By the time Nebuchadnezzar came west, Jehoiakim had died, and his son Jehoiakim was on the throne. The city of Jerusalem was set under siege and surrendered on March 16, 597 BC. Jehoiakim was taken to exile in Babylon along with many of the people, including the prophet Ezekiel. Ezekiel and Daniel were both major prophets in Babylon. Each one prophesying the fall of Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar set Zedekiah, Josiah's third son, on the throne. Almost from the start, Zedekiah became involved in seditious schemes against the Babylonians, and finally, with the promise of Egyptian support, he rebelled in 589 BC. The Babylonian army arrived in 588 BC and blockaded Jerusalem to prevent its stockpiling supplies. While other fortified cities were defeated, that summer the siege was lifted briefly as the Babylonians were diverted to meet an Egyptian force, and then was reinstated. By the following summer, July of 587 BC, the walls were breached and Jerusalem was sacked, the temple burned, and the people deported to Babylon. The Neo-Babylonian Empire did not long survive the death of Nebuchadnezzar. It was succeeded by 4 relatively obscure and apparently incompetent kings, and one could say that the handwriting was on the wall long before the fateful feast of Belshazzar on the eve of the fall of Babylon the Great. In fact, Cyrus had begun moving to consolidate his power within 5 years of the death of Nebuchadnezzar. Then from 550 to 450 BC, you had the Medo-Persian Empire. When the Babylonian king Nabonidus negated his treaty with the Medes and realigned himself with Cyrus and the Persians in 556 BC, it gave Cyrus the opportunity he had been waiting for to move against the Medes. He defeated them in 550 BC and became the ruler of the new Medo-Persian Empire. Over the next decade, he was able to defeat the Lydians, a major political force in western Anatolia, and extend his control in the east as far as the Indus Valley. He was now poised to move against Babylon, since numerous segments of the population had good reason to be disgruntled with the policies and prospects of Nabonidus. Cyrus was reportedly welcomed into Babylon on October 16, 539 BC, as deliverer rather than having to resort to a long siege. Cyrus was anxious to be recognized as a benevolent liberator rather than as a conquering tyrant, and he set policies towards that end. These policies included granting permits for many of the peoples deported by the Babylonians to return to their homelands and rebuild their temples. The Israelites were among them, and only a few of the Israelites returned at a time to rebuild the temple. Nevertheless, such permission assumed loyalty to the Medo-Persian crown and acceptance of its sovereignty. So although Israel was restored to the homeland, she was still without a king. Cambyses, the son of Cyrus, was able to add Egypt to the empire in 526 BC, but he died in an unfortunate accident on the return journey. According to Herodotus, Cambyses was wounded by his own sword as he attempted to mount his horse and died of the resulting infection. After some struggle, a throne was secured by Darius the Great, who, because of the difficulties surrounding the succession, was now faced with revolts in every quarter of the empire. By 519, however, he was able to put down the revolts and secure his rule. By the beginning of the 5th century BC, the Persians were coming into contact with the Athenians because of some rebellions against Darius in the western cities of Anatolia. This led Darius eventually to attempt an invasion of Greece, which failed miserably when his army was driven into the sea at the Battle of Marathon in 490 BC. When Darius died in 486 BC, it was left to his son Xerxes to renew the attempt. Xerxes in the Bible, in the book of Esther, was known as Ahasuerus. Disaster followed disaster. However, as the Persians were defeated at Thermopylae and Salami in Greece, and continued to suffer losses as they retreated through Anatolia, Xerxes was assassinated, and he was succeeded by his son Artaxerxes I, who officially sponsored the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem at the request of his Jewish cupbearer Nehemiah. War with the Greeks was dragged on, yet the Persian Empire remained in power. for another century until the lightning conquest by the younger warrior Alexander the Great in 331 BC. And from there, you would get into some intertestamental history, and we'll get into that in later videos. Until next time, may God richly bless you as you diligently study His holy written word. Hope this video was helpful to you.